So I'm just going to... Hello everyone who's joining us on the feed. Bear with us a second while we get this going. It's a very professional outfit, as you can imagine. Let's see. Just pin that. Pin, lovely. And go in here. And crikey, what I need to do is make sure I mute this. There we go. Okay, good stuff. I think it's happening. 10 people following. So this is going to be... Okay, right, this is going to be tricky because I'm going to have to follow the chat. Okay, everyone, so welcome. Welcome to Rail Natter. I'm very pleased to say we have Mike Muldoon from Alstom with us. I think you can see him in the corner. Hello, everyone. Hello. So this is... right, we're nearly there. Everyone, right, so... It says live in 8 hours. No, we're live now. We're here. I'm going to be following the chat on a thing down here because I've got to have another thing here to make sure this works. So this is not going to be as... Well, we'll see. But anyway, right. Without further ado, Mike sat there like, what is going on? We're just going to get started, I think. So welcome to another episode of Rail Natter. Oh, it's not Rail over the Pennines. Well, never mind. You can cope with the fact that I've not updated the episode title, but that's fine. Right, so as the 225 fades out, I'm pleased to bring us back to here we go. In fact, so that's the episode. It's episode 4, hydrogen trains. Should have fixed that. Here we are. Mike is here. There are already questions pouring in, Mike. Good grief. So, yep. Would hydrogen trains work better if they... Oh, crikey. Okay, so we've already... Yeah, let's not worry about... Right, that's happening. So this is going to work. Mike's going to go through some slides. It's going to be a nice chat. Every slide comes up. Ask your questions. I'll do my best to feed those through to Mike. But Mike's kind of just going to talk... I think, Mike, you're just going to have a talk about through the slides, right?
That's the plan. Yes, yeah. We'll see.
Yeah, that audio's... I mean, hopefully...
I can see them. I'll talk through them.
Yes, right. So... without further ado, I will. There we go. Yeah, so it's a very official looking thing, as you see. No expense spared. Yeah, Mike's going to talk about hydrogen trains. So what I'll do is I'll just kind of progress these slides through, and I'll let you chat about them. So yeah, on you go, Mike, and I'll feed you questions after you kind of after you make as you make points.
I can't see them at the moment, Gareth.
Ah, yes, right. So that's because I need to do this button here. There we go.
There we go. So basically then, hydrogen trains, and why are we doing it, and what have we got to do? Hydrogen trains have come to the forefront of many of our thinking because of the necessity to decarbonise the rail industry. And why we've got to do that? Well, I think probably everyone watching will be familiar with the general gist of the climate change issues that we face. It was the big emergency before the current big emergency, and I certainly hope will last a lot longer than the one we're dealing with at the moment. But that standalone, as a standalone thing, doesn't necessitate hydrogen trains unless or until we decide to do something about the climate emergency. And that was really the point of discussion with DfT some time ago, and with various stakeholders in the market. Well, if we want to introduce technologies like this, what's the driver? What's the imperative to do it? And we actually got one. Joe Johnson was the Minister of State for Transport for covering this area back in 2018. He's had numerous successes since. But anyway, at the time, he issued the challenge to the rail industry to map out how it would decarbonise. And that resulted in the response from the task force, you can see below. And he wanted us to achieve decarbonisation by 2040 in order that rail could contribute to the net carbon zero by 2050 objective for the UK, which, as you know, has now been set in legislation. The conclusion was we could, and we should. The Scottish government then leapt in and competed in this space and determined that Scotland's emissions should in fact be eliminated by 2035. So we've set ourselves some fairly challenging timescales. if you think about what they constitute in terms of rail planning and train product life, control periods, whatever you want to, however you measure your time, even just in years, 2035 is, if we assume they're going to start on the 1st of January, it's under 15 years away now, and we have an awful lot to do to achieve these objectives. So that really is the scene into which we step as we contemplate what we're going to do. As you press next for me.
Oh
please.
yeah, that's right. I'll mash the next button. While I keep that one up, we've got some questions that are coming, but I think they're going to be answered as we progress. So I'm going to hold fire on those, and yeah, we'll pop through to the next one.
So okay. So there's a climate imperative, but what does that mean in terms of, or why would we then talk about hydrogen trains? Why do they have a part to play? I mean, let's face it. We all know electrification is the most efficient means of providing energy to power trains. Bottom line, that's a fact. And Alstom, as a major supplier of electrification, would love to see every route mile in every country electrified. I'm sure we could do a lot of business with a lot of providers and system operators if that were the case. But of course, pragmatically, we know there are places where we have no wires, and then we're going to have to store the energy for driving the train on board. Let's face it then, in those terms, we know that charging batteries is more efficient than creating hydrogen. You'll read all about this, you'll have seen all these arguments. Elon Musk is a prime exponent of the fact that if you charge a battery, you merely introduce electricity to the energy store and you draw electricity out. It's an efficient process. He's absolutely right. So we understand batteries, we understand electrification. We've never used hydrogen. It sounds like it's not necessarily the obvious place to go. So why is hydrogen coming to the fore? Why are we talking about it? Why are we building hydrogen trains and proposing more? If we look on the next slide, we need to really start from that question of storing energy. Why, if we're going to store it, what are the issues that we have to deal with? So that objective of a fully electrified railway is a long way off in terms of the actual extent of electrification that we have so far. So we're looking at a store. We need something that will carry energy and not create emissions. So if we look at energy storage media, diesel is fantastic. This is why we love liquid hydrocarbons. In terms of the energy density per litre, it's incredibly efficient. It's flexible, in a liquid form, easily handled, admittedly a little bit hazardous if mishandled, but acceptably so. And we have years and years of experience using it, and 70 years plus of mainline operation of diesel trains in this country. So that's why we love it so much. It's a very practical and flexible store. Problem we have is if we're going to replace diesel, and if we're going to accept that's what we're going to do, then we really have to look at alternative stores. Hydrogen is pretty good. It's actually very dense in energy terms per unit weight. The trouble is it's a gas, so it doesn't weigh a lot. So in density per unit volume, it's also got very low energy density at atmospheric pressure because it's a very low density gas. So in fact, you have to compress it to 350 bar, so roughly 5,000 pounds per square inch, in order to get it to a state where it contains, roughly speaking, an eighth of the energy per litre that your diesel would contain. So quite a lot of effort there to get something that is 8 times less efficient in space terms on board the train. By way of reference, some of the best lithium-ion batteries are about half as efficient in volumetric terms. So they're going to need 16 times the space. And per unit of mass, energy density of batteries is incredibly poor, which is why you tend to have big, heavy batteries. Every time you want to do something more with batteries, you increase your weight and space requirements. So that's why we're looking at hydrogen, because it sits in between the two. It gives us sufficient energy in a broadly accommodatable space to allow us to look at how we can propel trains in a zero-emission way. Of course, all this is predicated on the fact that neither hydrogen nor batteries, when used to power the train, will generate emissions at point of use. So the train will be a zero emission product.
So just while we've got this slide up, Mike, I thought based on a couple of questions we've had already, just like in the steam era, there was a lot of momentum to kind of overcome with steam operation in the UK, even to moving to diesel, let alone electric traction. Have you found that there is still within the industry a lot of momentum or kind of comfort with diesel as a form of traction, or do you find that's not the issue? The issue is more the politics and the commercial element.
No, I think the issues cover all of those brackets. I think there is a huge level of familiarity with operating diesel trains, and I think that familiarity translates into a naturally defensive position. And as we go through this, there are areas of deployment which don't suit hydrogen so well. And I should probably make very clear at this stage that none of this means hydrogen is the one solution for all our problems. And I think that's key to remember. As I said at the start of this, electrification is very effective and very efficient in many ways. It has its downsides, and we may come to some of that, I expect, with questions as well. But all of the technologies have their pros and cons. The point is now that the con of diesel has become a major factor in terms of carbon and clean air emissions. The other media are coming to the fore. But yeah, I mean, I imagine that there were many people protecting steam the day the first diesel rolled out. And so this just makes sense, there's no point doing it. It took us years to make that transition. I think, was it 1948 to about 1968 to get to transition from steam to diesel. Obviously with some electrification thrown in for good measure. But fundamentally, that's where they were. So I think we see the same kind of thing.
Yep. Yeah, it's certainly a challenge. As you say, it's not just at the top level. You talk about depot, operations kind of front facing to passengers, but depot side, all the momentum, all the equipment, the idea, but do we have to do something completely new, kind of on the back, behind the scenes as well? I suppose there's a lot to overcome on that front. Even with electric trains, that's still a problem, let alone hydrogen ones.
It is. I mean, if you look at the overall emissions of the UK rail sector, about 30% of them still come from electric trains because the grid isn't clean yet, and we have other factors involved with how do we move that infrastructure inside the depots from one place to the next. It is going to be tricky. There are possible substitute fuels for diesel. Some of those can be very carbon efficient. They're not so good on the NOx and particulates front. And I think some studies are starting to suggest that adoption of compressed gases for trucks and lorries in urban environments is actually worse than running on diesel.
Interesting.
Unintended consequences. So you get. I think we're all on a voyage of discovery here. But certainly at the moment, what's irrefutable is that the vehicles themselves become zero emission. You've then got to deal with the process scheme of things, and you've got to deal with all of those infrastructure support necessities to make the transition.
Yep. Right, let's hop on to the next slide then. So, okay, interesting, yeah.
Yeah, so I'd like to be a little bit controversial. The point here, though, is we shouldn't be comparing with diesel. The thing about diesel is that it is officially going to be dead. I maybe jumped the gun by saying it is dead already, but going back to that point earlier, if a train has a life of 35 years, and you're looking at buying a train today that happens to operate in Scotland, are you really going to buy a diesel, which by the time you put it into service could have an operating life of 10 to 12 years? You're probably not. Diesel is already almost an unattainable dream, assuming the policies don't change again. So realistically, we shouldn't be saying, how does it compare to diesel? How complex is it to roll out in relation to diesel? Should we keep the diesel because it's simple? We can't really say that because we can't use it anymore.
Yeah, so, it's as simple as that, really, isn't it? It's done.
Yeah. So a rolling program of electrification. I think the industry's done a huge amount of work to redress the misplaced misconception, or perhaps if they're misconceptions, they're probably well placed. The misconceptions around electrification in the political sphere that led to the changes that we saw in about 2015, when Chris Grayling, in particular, was very anti-electrification programs, and so it came across, whether it's his department himself or whatever, doesn't really matter. We all veered towards bimodes, which of course include diesel traction, and we sort of ridiculed electrification as an outrageously expensive luxury. Clearly it isn't, and I think RIA and others have done a huge amount of work to redress the understanding of what goes on there, and a continuous rolling electrification program would both ensure we could start to see areas electrified, but it would also bring down the cost of doing it. But it won't do it all for reasons of cost, for reasons of the fundamental disruption of doing the electrification and the impact that would have on our future patronage of the railways. If we drive everyone off for donkey's years while we modify everywhere, we've then got to attract them back. There's a risk in that. And we also have actual environmental issues around electrifying itself because of the environmental elements associated with the works themselves and with the embedded carbon in all the kit that we fit, which will become a bigger factor, as we saw in the recent challenge with Heathrow, where they were deemed not to have considered the overall environmental impact sufficiently. So I think there's a mix, but most significantly probably is now, with the timescales we have, even if we wanted a fully electrified railway, there aren't the resources available to actually do it.
Yep. And yeah, definitely. Sorry, go on, Mike.
No, that's right. I mean, what that means is really, hydrogen and electrification are simply complementary technologies, and so are battery trains, or battery EMUs as we know them, where the battery is used for the shorter range hops, maybe in combination with some form of discontinuous electrification or whatever. There is a place for all of these technologies in what will be the future of railways. Same as we'll see on the roads with hydrogen vehicles, electric battery vehicles, what have you, whatever else may come along. But fundamentally, we need all of these technologies in order to deliver the outcome that we're charged with delivering.
So what I'm going to do is because there's quite a lot of interesting points that you've raised on that slide, and we've got a few good questions in. So I think I'll go back through a few questions if I can.
Sure.
The first one is, I'll pick a question from David Thompson, who's asking if we're likely to see brand new hydrogen rolling stock in the UK, or just conversions of old stock. Or in fact, I tell you what, no, I'll hold that one off because I think I know slides that are coming up next. So actually, I'll hold that one. I'll ask one from David Shearers, which is, he's asking about electrolyser plants that are installed at a depot generating hydrogen at the point of use. So he's asking, is it correct that hydrogen infrastructure isn't really an issue? That's from David Shearers.
This is a really interesting one, actually, because a hydrogen train without hydrogen is a chocolate teapot, isn't it? It has no purpose. So what we've had to look at is, how do you provide a system to support the train? And the logical answer in today's environment is to produce the hydrogen where you need it. So David refers to electrolyzers. Electrolyzers are a bit like a fuel cell operating in reverse. Instead of consuming hydrogen, they produce it from electricity and water, along with oxygen. So from that point of view, you can create a generation facility on site, create your hydrogen through the day while the trains are out operating, and then dispense it overnight to refuel the fleet. So that can be done. That is something that logically sits within or very close to a depot, and is one of the elements that supports the features of hydrogen trains, really. We don't envisage recharging during a day. You don't envisage sort of stopping halfway through the day and refueling if you can avoid it. The whole point is that the range is sufficient to allow you to fuel in one place at a time, and a method that's very similar actually to diesel. So it comes from something that looks like a pump, and takes about the same kind of time as it takes to fill a diesel train. So from that point of view, the use case for the operator, for the maintainer, is to try and keep things as familiar as possible.
Okay, yeah, which I think answers Giel's question, which is whether you can fuel up a train with hydrogen that's on a route within normal station stopping times. It sounds like certainly from your perspective, it's more you're going to have fuel it up at the diagram at the depot sufficiently that it can complete a diagram, so complete what it has to do in the day before it's back at depot again. That sounds like that's what you think is the right approach.
We absolutely do. The German trains are configured for that, and our concept for the UK is exactly the same. We don't think it's, well, the more you spread the infrastructure, the more you spread the support network, the more complicated you make both the operation and the planning for the route. All you need is a charger to fail, let's say, or a train out on the network that can't move out of a location because it can't be charged. Doesn't really feel satisfactory. So the objective is to try and provide enough range on the train to allow it to do its full days of operation with sufficient in reserve to be comfortable, and then just run the train through the day so that the operator has the most familiar cycle. Now, appreciate diesel trains today often get pushed out for 2 or 3 days using very large tanks on board. That luxury may not be something that can be offered with hydrogen simply because of that volumetric constraint I talked about. If it's 8 times more space, we can't necessarily accommodate everything sufficient on board to go more than a day. So there are still compromises operators are asked to make, but we're trying to minimise those to maximise the convenience of the system.
We're going to have to change the way that we can't think, as this sort of slide, if I pop it back up, sort of makes the point, we can't think in kind of diesel mind frame. The world is changing, we need to change with it, and if that means that we have to change the operational patterns of trains at the fringes of the network, then so be it. Really, that's just something that the train operators are going to have to stomach, I think. I do have I suppose that kind of answers David Shepherd's question as well, which was asking about how much infrastructure is required to distribute hydrogen versus distributing electricity. Well, I suppose actually that's kind of a moot point because you're just relying on distributed electricity to generate the hydrogen at the depot, if I've got the right end of the stick.
You have, yes. So you do need a healthy electricity supply at the depot, but you wouldn't be looking to create incidental points around the network. That's not to say you couldn't, and maybe people will come up with models where at a terminus station there's an opportunity to do that on particularly long routes. But the preferred way of operating would be to avoid needing to build that into your timetable, because obviously, as we know, when the trains are out, you want them out earning revenue and you want them out operating.
And then the last question before we move on, we're doing all right time-wise actually. Thanks for these questions, by the way, everyone. This is really good. We'll hopefully get through them a bit as we go through the slides again. So David Shepherd again asks, it's quite nice, I quite like this question. He heard that hydrogen fuel creates water, which I think is correct. Would that cause any problems? Does it make steam or water leak into the train? He's seen aircon units on London Overground trains leak in hot weather. So it's quite an interesting question about water production there. Yeah,
that is the output actually, and in fact, our lawyers in Germany won't allow us to call the train zero emission because they do emit water. And so they aren't strictly in legal sense zero. The water that comes out is a kind of, it's a bit like distilled water. So it's incredibly pure. And in fact, hydrogen fuel cell powered road vehicles have been shown to clean the air that they actually intake through the fuel cells. And Hyundai have demonstrated they can actually improve the air cleanliness in a city by using their vehicles in the city. That's a slight an aside. The volume of water that comes out and the amount of steam is remarkably low, actually.
Okay.
On the German train, which obviously is in operation, you can fill a small drinking glass from the exhaust pipe, and you could, if you felt so like it, you could safely drink that glass. I wouldn't drink too much of it because distilled water isn't that good for you, but it's certainly not harmful. Again, the lawyers wouldn't let you, so don't try it.
Yeah.
We had Roger Harrabin, the BBC correspondent over in Germany. He wanted to drink it, and they wouldn't let him. So, but it can be done, and you can see it on YouTube if you look for people with hydrogen cars. They'll drink the output water. The steam, again, it just depends on the weather conditions, whether it comes out, whether you get condensate as water or steam, and you would deal with it just like your condensing boiler does in your house, a small runoff pipe. So we don't have the same problems with the aircon leakage.
Yeah, that's all right. Thanks for that. We'll come back to some questions, so keep sending them through. I'll do my best to kind of whiz back and forth through those, but I think we'll crank on to the next slide, which we'll put up there.
Yeah, and this brings us on really to what can these trains do? I mean, they best suit regional passenger services. That's because of the mix of range, speed, and volume of energy we can carry on board suits that type of service. And by that service, I mean stuff, we're talking a range of in excess of 1,000 kilometres, which is about 625 miles. Speeds of up to 160 kilometres an hour. So that those two factors make them sort of category A and B in the sort of categorisation that's been adopted for vehicle types in the decarbonisation strategy, for example. The train itself is actually a battery hybrid, so it carries a battery as well, rather than being an energy power battery. It's an energy battery, so we use it in a slightly different way to a battery-powered train, but we use it to capture regenerative energy and to boost acceleration to minimise the use of hydrogen, as you'd expect. And as we are so familiar in this industry with doing, it's not a novelty, it is on cars. We expect the performance is intended to match or slightly improve on the DMUs that we aim to displace. Again, that's because, at least initially, this is about substituting a new technology for an existing technology to deliver the same service to the customers. As we go forward, it will give us options potentially to increase performance and perhaps improve timetables. A lot of these routes aren't yet at the stage where, in terms of passenger loadings and sort of section times are the problem they have. The problem they have is dirty old technology. So that's the first thing to solve. The refill time process is very similar to filling up a diesel train, as I was saying. So it literally is you hook up a supply pipe which delivers from a pump, and the system is fully automated, monitors itself, and ensures that it's safe and secure. And once the pressure in the fuel tanks has reached the 350 bar, you shut off, and you have your full range. They do perform in all weathers. We've done extensive trial operations around, particularly in Germany and into the Alps and other areas you can see there. Again, we don't get the same performance degradation that you would see with batteries, particularly in cold weather. So the range is robust, not dependent on the conditions, which is good. And also the other side product from a fuel cell is heat. So that can be harnessed for actually onboard heating purposes. Again, like we do with diesels, so similar usage. One of the beauties of introducing hydrogen trains, if you want to replace them on your particular diesel route, is that you can build your hydrogen fuel facility. You can bring your fleet onto depot, and arguably, if you wanted to choreograph it that way, you could just flick a switch overnight and switch to hydrogen operation from diesel. You haven't got that line of route activity that electrification brings with it. Yeah. Obviously, we know ways of managing how to do electrification works, but with restricted access and other things, that's part of the cost driver that makes electrification expensive. You can avoid that with this. But again, horses for courses. And where have we got to with it? So based on those capabilities, we now have 41 Coradia Islands ordered, which will enter service in next year. The original 2 pre-series units were operating in service in Germany from September 2018 until about 2 months ago. They've since operated in the Netherlands and are due to be operating next month in Austria. I'm not aware whether that's been affected by the current travel restrictions there.
Yeah, so I've got a couple of questions while we've got this one up. In fact, good grief, they're flying in now. Right, so, wait a minute, I'll just tell you who's asking that question. Owen O'Neill asked a question, which I think is a good one. Given the life of rail vehicles, should we be thinking about them as a vehicle we can plug a power pack into, which can then be changed as different energy sources develop? And I think that will possibly feed into some of the later slides, but I thought I'd ask it now anyway.
I suppose in an ideal world, yes. The problem is, the reason we're looking at hydrogen now is hydrogen is a known technology today. Making provision for anything always adds cost. So if you want to have something that's ready to receive something else, normally it costs you extra money to make that provision. When you don't know what you're making that provision for, it can become even more complex. So I suspect that up to a point, yes, replaceable power packs, and I know the argument goes that any bi-mode arguably has a removable diesel engine. You might then have to ballast the train again to take away the benefits of removing the engine in some ways. But there are prospects around that. While we have these differences in the volumetric requirements and things like that, it may or may not work. I know there are some who are claiming that they can already offer this facility. I don't think anyone's demonstrated how they're going to make such a conversion work. And even when you look at the idea of hot swapping batteries, so rather than waiting to charge a battery, you swap a battery that's fully charged in. If you think about it, when batteries weigh tons, not grams or kilograms, but tons, and you've got a train full of people, how are you going to swap a battery? But, you need a forklift, you need line-side access, you need lots of things. So yes, where we can, a train is like your house. You don't bulldoze it when you redecorate. And we're speaking on networks and wireless systems and LANs and all sorts of things wired into our houses that they were never built for. So you can do that with the basic body shell, but specifically designing in for unknown technologies will be very difficult.
Yep. That's a good answer to a good question. Let's have a look. So, oh crikey, these are flying through thick and fast. And what I might do is capture some of these in an email and send you through, and I can respond to them later, because there's millions of questions I'm trying to keep on top of, which is good stuff. I'll tell you what, let's go on to the next slide, and I'll pick through some more questions that I like the look of. Let's do this, and then this. Yeah, there we go.
Okay. So that brings us on then, obviously, to what we are doing in the UK. We have, for the last probably 2 years or so, been working with Eversholt Rail. We decided to work with them. We were looking at fleets in the UK suitable for conversion, and I know somewhere we've got banked that question about conversion versus new build, Gareth. So perhaps I'll address it a little bit in why we're looking at converting these particular trains. We felt that we're expecting the market to adopt a brand new technology. We're coming to that market and saying, here, try this. I think from an investor perspective, in terms of the likes of Eversholt Rail, and also those that may be investing in what they want to do in terms of fuel facilities, because a lot of that involves fuel providers who will be making significant investment. We're trying to hit a sweet spot where the volume of early introduction is sufficient to make it economic and plausible, while we're not actually compromising or asking for an impossible investment. So if you look at a converted train, you're going to operate it for a shorter period of time. The period for return on investment is shorter, but the lease expectation can be managed, and we can look at how you insert that into the market in a bit more of a cost-effective way. Going forward, when the market is established, so if you imagine going back to those days in 1948 when they started rolling out the first diesels, each time a fleet went somewhere, a fuel facility had to go with it. The same applies to hydrogen. As that network starts to build, a hydrogen-powered train, which lease companies will consider to be an asset, that asset gains value because it can be used elsewhere. It's movable, it's redeployable, and the risk of building those new trains comes down. So we expect to see a very rapid transition from conversion into new builds. But the Class 321 fleet is ideally suited for our needs, is due to come off lease, or was due to come off lease quite very imminently. It's a little bit longer now, but that's fine. And it makes the perfect basis, we feel, for conversion. Going back to redecorating that house, it's got all the bits we need. And we can, and as demonstrated by Eversholt's work on the Renatus project, it lends itself to becoming fully a 21st century train, or will fit it with 21st century traction equipment. And that will be based on what we've done in Germany. So we've got to repackage that kit. The German train's much bigger than the British train, so we've got to make it all fit. There will be a first-of-kind homologation process of system approvals, which I don't think any of us would underestimate the potential complexity of, both politically and technically, frankly. But that needs to be gone through, and unless or until someone actually does it and addresses the real issues, we can all sit around as long as we like trying to second guess what will be the complexities of achieving that outcome and getting that certification. but unless or until someone actually does it, we won't know. So I think that we're very keen to push on, recognising that there's a risk involved in being first, in order to lay the way for the broader conversion of the market.
So yeah, there's a lot of life in those Class 321s actually. I mean, you see with the converted 319s, the upgraded 319s up in Manchester that are running electric services up there. There's a lot of life in those locos, so in those units. So there's it's kind of an obvious choice for conversion. It's no coincidence that the same train family are the ones that are being converted by your competitors for similar purposes. They're good solid family of units. Those. I've got a question from, or actually, kind of a couple of questions that are talking about. Compression, if you like, of hydrogen and the equivalent in terms of batteries. So I'm going to slightly adapt Jeff Wade's question, which is about the fact that battery technology is improving constantly. Is there a ceiling? And his question really is there a ceiling that hydrogen can reach that batteries won't? But I'm going to flip the question a little bit for you to answer, which is, do you see there being an opportunity for compression of hydrogen to improve over time? Are there kind of key technologies that there's an issue, but you reckon that could be solved in time, or is it just a physics equation?
I think physics actually applies to both. The point I made earlier about us all being very familiar with batteries is that I can remember as a child, a long time before you were, putting AA batteries in toys. I still put AA batteries in toys for a whole new generation of children, and I probably will be in 20 years' time. Do those AA batteries give me a whole lot more than they used to? Actually, no, they don't. And my iPhone still runs out of charge every day, no matter which model I buy and how modern it is and how improved that battery is. The laws of physics apply to batteries as well, and I think there is a myth around the rate of change of battery technology and the rate of improvement. Yep. So we have to be careful that we don't back ourselves into a position of saying, well, basically the technology will improve and our problems will be solved, and we just can have a faith in that. We can't do that. So where does that leave us with hydrogen? Hydrogen, the 350 bar compression standard has been adopted for commercial vehicles. It's based on the fact that it's deemed to require or to compress to sufficient level not to require too much space on the vehicle, and those vehicles are generally larger, therefore they have more space. Is the view. There is a standardized range of equipment for handling the gas at that pressure. But also the fueling process is slightly simpler, because one of the issues you have with refueling with hydrogen is that as hydrogen travels into a tank and transitions across and pressures change, you generate heat. So generating that heat, you generate more pressure. If you're not careful, you could have a self-sustaining situation where the pressure increases in an uncontrolled fashion. And that goes back to what I was saying about the monitoring systems that are involved in refueling. So there is a constant monitoring of that to ensure you don't have that. And we're talking sort of molecular level friction and all sorts of stuff that causes this heat generation. So we'd have to get chemists on to talk.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
But the bottom line is you're managing a number of factors. If you happen to get yourself a hydrogen car, which you can do, they're available on the UK market. And it's not a straightforward purchase, and refueling is not well distributed, but you can do it. You'd actually be filling your car at 700 bar. And that standard has been adopted for road cars because of the space constraints that they have. And a 700 bar tank on a car will give you plenty of capacity to do sort of 300-400 miles, which is petrol equivalent and therefore deemed to be very beneficial. But you have to chill the gas to refuel, and you have to do other complexities. So there are pros and cons to all of these things. The point is the road sector often drives a lot of technological development. It's the one we expect to drive batteries. It will also drive hydrogen. And so will other applications. So I couldn't say that tomorrow someone won't come out with a dream, the pen cell that powers everything. But just at the moment, there's a huge amount of money going into that development. We'll have to see what it can yield.
And it's interesting you use the mobile phone analogy there. Is one thing that trains have, their hotel power, if you like, the amount that they draw without going anywhere has increased almost to a quantum level. Sort of for the last, it's just been leaping and leaping for the last sort of 20 years. The amount of hotel draw from an IET or a one of the various new units that are running, one of the Aventras or whatever it is, from your competitors, they consume huge amounts just sitting doing nothing now, because everyone wants to plug their phones in. They want to be, all the customer information systems. I think this is David Shearers who I think wrote about this for the Permanent Rail Engineering blog. Actually, I think it's about a megawatt hotel draw from a train, and it's just not moving, and so batteries get better, potentially hydrogen gets better, but actually the hotel consumption of trains continues to increase as well, as we want all of our fancy gadgets and gizmos to be plugged in.
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head, and I think the point about emissions, the point about all of this, is that the best way to cut your emissions is actually to use less energy. And to use less energy, you need to look at things like lightweighting. You need to look at all of those peripheral systems, making sure that you have the absolute minimum draw. I mentioned reusing heat. Waste heat can be reused. We regenerate electricity on board in order to reduce the amount of overall expended energy in powering and driving the train. Everything has to be focused on that. And if you start from that place, design your product around that, you can start to make inroads to offset the demands that we as a society are putting on everything at the moment.
And then the last, we'll move on to the next slide and tick. We've had quite a few questions about safety, as you'd expect. It's hydrogen. People still have that black and white image of the Hindenburg going up in smoke when it comes to hydrogen. So we've had one question about training specialist firefighters. Do we need to do that? And then another about general safety and about the fact that some hydrogen plants have gone pop in America recently. So I suppose general safety considerations. Tell us about safety and what you've done, what Alstom have done from a safety perspective, and what you think about hydrogen from a safety perspective.
Well, I think our perspective on it is that any form of stored energy is a potential hazard. I think that's not our perspective. That's just general fact. So as we all know, anything a compressed spring is a form of stored energy, and if it's decompressed in an uncontrolled manner, it could cause you harm. So from that point of view, you've got to approach it like you would anything that contains that risk. The approvals process for the Coradia Island went through a standard railway approvals process based on the common safety method and risk assessment. There are no regulations specific to hydrogen trains in Germany, just like there aren't here. And there weren't any required ultimately to achieve approval of the train, because you have to use subject matter expertise and you have to address it. Now, there is quite a large body of subject matter expertise. Hydrogen is novel to us in the rail sector, but of course the compressed gas sector has been using it for decades. And we've been moving it around the country for decades and handling it in various industrial processes for that kind of time. So in fact, it's not, yes, in the broadest definition, it's hazardous, but frankly, there are technologies and methodologies available for handling it. And some of those I've already referred to in the fueling process and everything else, because it's established equipment and established processes, and we as an industry need to adapt and adopt those processes to suit what we need to do. I think it is worth a couple of things. I should say bingo, because you said Hindenburg, and that's
yes, yeah.
Obviously, there are many theories around what happened there, but it wasn't compressed hydrogen in that anyway. It was actually just in its standard form. But I think our view is it's safe. The view of the authorities in Germany was it's safe. It's proved to operate in tunnels up to 5 kilometres. It's not something that is treated as more or less hazardous than other energy stores. And incidentally, as much of our certification effort in Germany was on the battery as it was on the hydrogen traction system.
Yeah, and batteries go pop too, in a big way when they want to, depending on the technology that's. Anyway, the point being that electrification is also very dangerous. It's not. We're dealing with dangerous stuff. Trains are heavy. Trains are dangerous no matter what they're powered with. These are systems that it's a safety critical industry. There's so many levels of as you say, assurance that you have to go through to make sure we're all comfortable that safety is the number one thing. That trains are. The new trains you're introducing are no less safe than the ones they're replacing, if you like.
I think it comes back to familiarity as well. We are willing, culturally, we're willing to accept risks that we feel we understand. We all sit in cars, sitting on top of petrol tanks, which we've watched a million movies that show us what happens to a petrol tank if it ignites. We know what happens there. There are 5,000, I believe it was 5,000 petrol station fires a year in America. But we accept that. That's an acceptable risk to give us the upside of travelling. I don't want to diminish or belittle in any way the necessity to manage hydrogen very carefully. It is like all of these energy stores, it has its potential downsides, and we have to act accordingly.
Excellent. Yeah, right. I shall return us to the slides, conscious that it's 1:45 and I've nattered too much. Right. Yes. Here we go. Oh, in fact, there we go. There's your. It's not very
so there
nice,
you go. That's what a 321 looks like, or will look like after we've had our play with it. So that gives you the image, the identity of the train. We've called it Breeze. Most hydrogen projects start with the two letters high. We just didn't want to go there because everyone else had. But fundamentally, you wouldn't expect ever to see the train look like this as such. I'd expect it to be liveried by operators for normal integration into their fleets in a seamless manner.
It does look very nice. Although, as you say, I'm not sure we'll necessarily see any out. I don't know. Are you going to livery up the first one that's running around like that, or do you think it'll be in it?
that will boil down to customers' preference. The customer is always king in these matters. I think whoever does it and however we do it, the words "powered by hydrogen" will be prominent.
Yeah, makes sense. Right, here we go. So this is referring a bit towards. So towards hydrogen and some of the other kind of the wider macroeconomic stuff, which I think is really important, and we've had quite a few questions about that. So I'll let you talk through this one.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think there's a point to recognise in all of this that there's a lot of talk about building gigafactories in Britain and all sorts of collateral benefits or argued benefits of the electric car revolution or anything else. I think the problem we have is that we've already lost ground in battery technology production. The Chinese pretty much own the world. Bosch pulled out of traction batteries because they just felt they couldn't compete. For road vehicles. So from that point of view, I think we have to accept that we need to find other avenues for the new, British industrial revolution that we need to have in order to, get ahead in the world. Hydrogen could offer us an avenue for that, and hydrogen trains would drive demand for a lot of the high-value systems we have on board, like fuel cells, like electrolyzers to create the hydrogen, storage tanks, control systems. All of those are at a very early stage of development. There isn't a huge global supply chain feeding them. We have a real chance here, making these local investments in each locality where we deploy the fleets, where there will be jobs created and skills created that don't currently exist, to either build and operate the fueling stations or to support the fleets. We also have an opportunity to collect the individual benefits of those at a national scale and start to create a supply chain here that could then lead into export markets. And I think that's something that perhaps we forget as the rail industry. We're normally very small. We're normally a niche compared to other sectors, and our diesel engine. The diesel engines required by the rail industry the equivalent is probably produced by Volvo before the morning tea break on a shift, what we need in a year. So but in this case, we can help to drive it together with the bus sector and other sort of heavy good vehicles. We can really start to feed in and create the need for a supply chain. You can't create a supply chain without demand. You've got to have demand first.
So we've had a few queries. First one, you'll be happy to hear that Roaming Adocrat is very impressed by the Alstom-esque headlight clusters on that 321. So you'll be glad to hear that. I think you might answer the next one on an oncoming slide, but I'll ask it anyway, just in case, and you can say, wait a second. Matt Reed asks, when should we expect to see the first hydrogen train in commercial operation? Ooh.
Well, we do come to that, but the rate we're going, we might not get there. So if someone was, to be honest, the introductory process really is dependent on the first orders for the trains. Our intention is to deploy a fleet and to get into you need to do that to verify all of the operational factors around adoption of hydrogen in the market. If we want to look at a demonstration train, you're very welcome to come to Germany or Austria and ride one. It exists, and we've done that. So as we look at rolling out a fleet, you could see them in commercial operation by sort of late 2023. We would estimate at the moment, but that needs a fairly swift move towards realization of an order or a contract to actually progress. And you might say, well, why don't we build them, out of scheme ahead of any order? Again, from an Alstom perspective, we've demonstrated that we've done it, just not in this country. Early discussions with various industry groups suggested that it wasn't appropriate. We don't need to do an industry demonstrator. You could have a look at a Hydroflex if you want. That's shown that hydrogen can make a train move. It's not a production solution, though. What we're talking about here is delivering a production solution, an actual product, as opposed to a test bed. To do that, it would probably take until that kind of time frame.
Right, yeah, I'm conscious of time. I don't mind running over a bit because we don't have any other TV programs to bump out the way, but I'm conscious of your time more than anything else. So we'll press on, and I think we'll go through the slides now and then round up any questions at the end.
Sorry, I thought we'd get cut off. We don't cut off.
No. Yeah, we'll just delay the horse racing or whatever it is after us. That's fine.
Okay. Now, we've kind of covered this a lot anyway. The point here is that you can get hydrogen in different colours. It's a colourless gas that comes in colour, which is a bit random, but fundamentally there are a number of ways of producing it. Most production, almost all of it in the country at the moment, is effectively industrial production using a process called steam methane reformation. As you can imagine, if it uses methane, it involves carbon, so it's not carbon free. That means you get what's called brown hydrogen. And if you use brown hydrogen, although your vehicle is zero emission, if you measure your emissions from well to wheel, then arguably you have got a carbon footprint that's not significantly better than, it is significantly better than basic diesel emissions, but it's not where you want to be. But it's a good starting point because the train doesn't care what colour the hydrogen is. So you could clean up your stations, clean up the air quality in city centres where trains sit idling. You could do a lot of things and make a lot of immediate health improvements, even if you don't hit the carbon goal in one step. But as you go forward, you'll want to clean up your hydrogen. There's a couple of ways of doing that. One is that you capture the carbon that you produce. So carbon capture, usage and storage, CCUS, is now very much back in the forefront of government thinking and involves putting carbon gases back under the North Sea and in other caverns from which we've extracted carbon gas. Again, it takes a bit of getting your head around, but it's not like burying waste. What you're doing is putting a carbon gas back where a carbon gas came from. So you're kind of rebalancing things there in a way. But obviously it's a finite opportunity, and although UK is particularly well placed in terms of the amount of resources we have for it, we haven't got it online yet. Then there's green hydrogen, which goes back to the electrolyzers that David mentioned earlier. If you hook up an electrolyzer to a renewable energy source, you have an entirely carbon-free well-to-wheel process. You have probably, second only to the bicycle, the cleanest means of land transport, because there is nothing involved there in terms of carbon emissions, nor are there any particulates or NOx or anything else. So you've got a really clean system, and that could mean the first hydrogen trains could leapfrog every other form of train and every other form of land-based vehicle in Britain and become the sort of leading means of carbon-free transport.
Is that if you're suggesting that you stick a turbine up at the depot and use that entirely, so you can guarantee a renewable source?
Yes, you can, depending how you can draw your electricity. If you can draw it from a renewable source, then yes, you can do it that way. But it doesn't take it's not a huge amount of renewable energy that's required, or a huge amount of turbines. It varies depending on their scale and size, but you can do quite a lot with relatively small resources.
Do you want me to flip to the next slide? That's a good one for everyone to pay attention to. That some good numbers. Here we go.
Yeah, and I think this is where this fits into the bigger picture again. So we talked about export potential. We talked about industrial benefit. Also, probably some of the people on the call won't know this. I certainly didn't before I started lifting the bonnet on all of this stuff. There's a huge amount of work going on in what is called the hydrogen economy for the UK at the moment. And that is looking at how do we decarbonise heavy industry? How do we decarbonise all sorts of industrial processes that require high levels of heat? And how do we actually decarbonise home heating? Home heating is actually one of the biggest polluting sectors in the country because 99% of us or thereabouts, have a gas boiler. We burn methane in that boiler and we emit carbon. And we don't think of it in those terms, but that is the reality. Hydrogen actually is compatible with the gas grid, where the grid's been updated to the plastic pipe, which it has to be by legislation over the next couple of years. In that process of upgrading the grid makes it hydrogen compatible. That's a happy coincidence. That wasn't by design, but that's how it works out. The people that are currently supplying natural gas have a vested interest in all those assets stuck in the ground, and they are very keen to look at options to convert to the production of the use of hydrogen in the gas grid. HyNet is one project based around the Liverpool region, led by the likes of Cadent. Cadent are also involved in the one on the right, which is H21, which is also Northern Gas Networks and other groups. There are plans with Scottish Electricity, the grid provider in Scotland that also covers the south of England. Many of our providers are actually looking at substituting hydrogen. The problem is getting it all off the ground, of course. How do you make the first steps? How do you get the first deployments? And that's the beauty of a train requiring its electrolyser plant, requiring its production and its consumption. If you build a fuel pump for a car or you build a supply for houses, unless or until people start to consume on an individual incremental basis, you've got no customers. Shell have been investing a lot in this sector because they recognise the writing's on the wall for their bread and butter. They have a number of hydrogen fuel stations in their regular petrol stations around the country. They invest a lot of money to make hydrogen available, and there's 100 cars on the road at the moment that can consume it. You can imagine the return on investment is dire. That it isn't the case with trains. We know that where the trains will be. We know their timetable. We know how much fuel they'll need. We know they need it every day, well, except Christmas Day, over for 10 years or whatever the period is. We become a very compelling customer. And that allows then investment in capacity to supply trains and potentially overcapacity to then expand that network for other users and other modes of transport and industrial consumption. So we actually have a part to play now in helping the progression of these plans to sort of decarbonise the UK on a broader level. Our opportunity to do so will be fleeting because ultimately these schemes will be huge and will then simplify our issues around sourcing hydrogen. But until they do, we're actually in the vanguard of rolling out hydrogen across the economy.
Yeah, it's quite a thought-provoking kind of slide, this one, isn't it? It's something that, certainly in the railway we don't have as much sight of, and that's perhaps something we can explore again in maybe another chat. 'Cause there's a lot there to take in, really. I'll bump us to the next slide, but I do have a few questions. So before we progress to this slide, 2 questions. The first, I can't remember who asked it. It might have been just one in my head, which is hydrogen for freight vehicles. Is that something that you, Alstom, have thought about, looked at, considered? Is it realistic?
At the end of the day, freight vehicles are basically trains, but they require more energy. So all of the issues I've described would apply to a hydrogen freight train. The problem is you need to carry a lot more hydrogen to generate the levels of power that are needed to move the train. So our current thinking has been focused on passenger vehicles. We are looking at loco applications, and I'm sure others are around the world as well. And I think I recall there was a loco converted to hydrogen in North America some time ago, actually, for demonstration purposes.
Yeah, it had it carried a tender around, basically, didn't it? I think,
yes,
full of hydrogen.
And tenders are one concept. If you need space, that's one way of gaining it. Now, of course, as everything on our railways, freight trains equally are constrained in the length they can be. So anything lost in terms of the space to carry the fuel is revenue lost in terms of what they can earn. So there are significant challenges in achieving freight trains powered by hydrogen, but those challenges are to the same extent less than achieving it with battery. So with known technologies at the moment, we're looking at ways that one could do that. We're also looking at shunting locomotives. and other applications, because of course there are a lot of those around the world, both in depots in the railway industry, but also in other industries and ports in particular, and places like that where all of those vehicles will need decarbonising, basically.
And then the next question, which is a really good one, which is from John Christoph, who I think is in the US actually, and he asked the question: isn't there a risk, or broadly, I'll paraphrase for it, isn't there a risk, or is there a risk that politicians pick up hydrogen as a panacea, a bit like they did with bimodes a few years ago, and run with it at the expense of OLE? And what can the industry do to combat that?
Yes, there absolutely is a risk. Everyone wants a silver bullet, but arguably we want it in every sphere of life, don't we? One solution fits all would be great. So yes, there is a risk, and that's part of the reason why I started this evening by saying we all know electrification is great, because we do, but we need to make sure others understand that as well. Those of us in the industry get it. We understand the necessity to mix these technologies. We do need to keep reiterating that message, and you're absolutely right. Similarly, the same way Chris Grayling was accused of adopting bimodes over and above everything else, I've also seen him described as being obsessed with hydrogen. I can't say that I came across that to quite such an extent, but politicians in particular need fast solutions to problems. They live in a relatively short-term environment, so we have to try and manage those expectations. And as we know, that's a perennial issue for rail, because our investment plans always span longer than a minister's office.
Yeah. Right, excellent. Oh, that's really good. Right, so let's press on with this slide, I think. Yeah.
Okay, so this addresses some of those questions about when could things happen, what needs to happen. So business cases with operators. So we have a franchise rail system in Britain, sort of, at the moment. Will we go back to it? We don't know. But whoever operates the trains, however they are brought into service, will be different to the operating models that we have currently. That needs to be evaluated and assessed. That then leads into the approval to proceed. And that must, at the same time, in parallel to proceeding with trains, you must proceed with the fuel stations. Otherwise, you simply won't achieve the joined up outcome that we need. And that then kicks off that safety case approval process that I described. It allows us to look to move all of the stakeholders through the necessary steps. And this is another reason why a demonstration train is only ever a bit of a false exercise, really, because you haven't taken all the stakeholders with you. You've got to, a safety case in Britain is owned by the operator, not by the manufacturer. You've got to involve the right players in the process. That then could lead to the dates you can see there, and follow-on fleets are merely constrained by the ability to recycle through that process. We would expect to actually build the trains at our Widnes facility. I think that might be on the next slide, Gareth.
Oh yeah, do you want me to flick through?
Exactly.
There we go.
It isn't quite. I'll come to that. But anyway, okay. I mean, and that then leads into those. It leads into a number of potential benefits for the system. But overall, that's the process we need to go through to put these trains into service.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Okay. So
and going back to the impact. So trying to make it relatable again in that political world, in the public domain. Me talking about delivering products to market and all that kind of thing can become a bit. I always get accused of using too many technical terms, if you like, commercially technical, if not technically technical. But basically, if you translated it and you wanted something to write on the side of a campaign bus, you might say that if we were able to replace merely half of the predicted demand for independently powered multiple units, trains that carry energy. So that's based on sort of DFT figures. There's 2,500 odd DMU carriages that would need replacing. So do that. You could be using 100 tonne plus of hydrogen a day quite easily. You could be saving about 533,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide. I'm not entirely sure what that looks or feels like. Obviously, it feels bloody
looks like a massive number, doesn't it? But
it does look massive. It's actually not that massive in some ways. It equates to 383,000 cars off the road. That's quite a big car park. So there's a benefit. You can more relatable in those terms. And if you relate that the removal of those cars in clean air terms, never mind the future improvement in the climate that all of this brings, the relatable numbers we have today relate to clean air. If you took that many cars off the road, you could extrapolate that to about 100 million a year in health costs and 110 premature deaths saved by converting the rail fleets. I think those are quite attractive numbers, especially if you happen to be one of the 110 people.
Yeah, absolutely. And so for an idea of scale, so a month of road transport emissions is around about, I think it's about 12 million tons equivalent CO2. So actually saving that per year is really good, but it shows how much further, it shows the importance of continuing to pull people away from road onto rail, because that, in terms of orders of magnitude, 500,000 tons is huge, absolutely huge. That's a massive proportion. It's a 16th of HS2's construction emissions, for example. But it's indicative that in rail, we're not that bad. No matter how we power our trains, we're not that bad. And I suppose we need to encourage, and it's encouraging people. The important thing is to encourage people onto the system. And this helps, actually, showing that we're making massive efforts to decarbonise our industry, despite the fact that the overall numbers are not necessarily colossal, will help people to realise that rail is the future transport.
And I think the other thing is to say that these trains will have more passenger capacity than they currently is utilised. So you could grow the travelling ridership without in any way impacting or increasing your emissions. That's not possible with individual personal transport at the moment. So, nor would it be until the grid is entirely renewable and green and there's no emissions associated with charging up your electric car.
Yeah,
related pod, whatever people want.
Yeah. Okay, I'll quickly ask a question. I'm conscious of time, but everyone, I've just apologised for us being late. No one seems to mind, so I'll try and wrap up reasonably quickly. Quick question, though, which was from Sarah Noble ages ago. So you've got 2023 as a number on there. Hydrogen cars have always had like a 5-year slip, like it's always been, it's 5 years away, it's 5 years away. That 2023, so from my perspective, I think the only thing holding it back is the delay to the Greater Anglia fleet. Is that right? So the new fleet for Greater Anglia. So it's a bit of a cascading issue. But once you guys get hold of the 321s, it will be happening.
There's a cascading issue, and there's a commercial issue as well. There has to be a demand. Like I said, we are offering up a supply chain here, but we need a demand, and we're working on that commercially to make sure that's all secure. So it's I wouldn't want to suggest that it's all to do with delays on new trains for Anglia. That's not the case, but it is. There's a lot of factors have to be aligned, and they're not all technical; they're commercial as well.
Excellent. Right. Okay. Next, we'll crack on to the next slide. Oh, here we go. Yeah, perfect. Oh, that kind of ties into what we were saying a second ago, actually.
It does. I mean, the bottom line here is the beauty of starting to make changes now. I think you talked about people defending diesel. I think people defend the status quo more generally and suggest that actually if we put off doing anything until sort of December 31st, 2039, we'll get the best out of the resources or the assets we've got now, and then we'll flick a switch and magically solve our problems. That's not going to work so smoothly, I think, as some might hope. But also, if you start to make change now, you're accruing benefit over the elapsed time. So if it's 15 years until we actually solve all of the routes and have everything fixed, for some of those 15 years, clean trains will be running constantly and accruing benefit in terms of carbon emission. So I think we can save lives today, tomorrow, and throughout the process. By doing this, we can also help to mitigate the frightening prospects of the climate change. Yep. And hopefully meet some of the expectations and heartfelt beliefs of those that are now starting to get much more vocal in their protests about industry and transport more generally.
Yeah, definitely, and it's a point that I try and make a lot, is that there are rarely panaceas. Like, actually, there's just a huge tapestry of solutions to the problems that we're facing, and climate change is no different. Arguably, it's kind of the perfect example of, like, there are just an unending list of different ways that we need to resolve that, even within the rail industry. Things like, how do we reduce consumption of stations? There's just an unending list, and hydrogen trains are certainly part of that tapestry. I suppose it's having a united front as an industry, no matter whether you've got no matter what hat you're wearing, and making the case that it's not an alternative to electrification. It's a stopgap, and also it's a solution at the fringes, and it's a solution where electrification isn't feasible or practical. And I suppose that's the key thing. But it's part of the mix. Oh yeah, nice. So that knocks us nicely into the kind of the any questions bit. But I think we've gone through quite a lot of the questions. If anyone's got if anyone's got questions they want to re-ask that I've missed, shout up now. We're only 10 minutes late. That's probably fine. Yeah. So let's say I'll just quickly have a trace through. There are quite a lot of people who are asking each other questions now about things. This generally happens in the chat, Mike, and which I love is that people just generally have a nice long chat about railways, which is great. Yes, MJ Gaming HD asked a question about how do you get into. Actually, he asked about the hydrogen industry more broadly, but I think about a career in how can MJ Gaming HD get involved in hydrogen trains and helping hydrogen trains to become a reality.
I think all of the rail manufacturers will be interested in this technology. We already have a number of specialist engineers recruited in the UK with the purpose of working on hydrogen development. I expect others will do that. But I think as well, there's a whole area around the supply chain. There are emerging businesses working in the areas of electrolyzers, in fuel cell technologies. There's opportunities starting to emerge. I think it is a bit of a voyage of discovery. If you start looking at Googling, for want of a better way of doing it, Googling around the UK environment, you can find references to some of these operators, some of these in early stage SMEs, a lot of them, who are now starting to progress into developing product. There are people in producing things like hydrogen fuel cell powered drones, motorcycles, all sorts of products that are already out there. A fuel cell drone can do warehouse stock takes for hours, where a battery will go up for 20 minutes. It's all about the same issues that we have in rail. It's a question of scaling things up.
So we've got a question from Michael C, which is, will bi-mode hydrogen trains be a thing so they're effective under the wires? So essentially bi-mode, but with hydrogen as the alternative source. What do you think about that?
That is a possibility, yes. Again, because of the same issue you have with diesel as you have with hydrogen in this instance, the range on the secondary traction system is compromised by it also being an electric train, but you can do it. And in fact, we are working on a project of that type with SNCF in France for exactly that type. So we've got numerous project alternatives going on at the moment. Having put ourselves out in the hydrogen space, we've been somewhat overwhelmed by the level of interest globally, actually. So let's have a look. Another good question, which I suppose I know what your answer is going to be, which is sure. But David Shepherd asks, should hydrogen depots, should the depots also fill up hydrogen buses as well as trains? Well, that's exactly the possibility, isn't it? And that's what I meant about overcapacity on the production facility. If we could combine transport modes or collectively bring together a range of users, that would be the optimal solution. It would justify investment in excess capacity at the fuel stations. But also, one of the things about a hydrogen infrastructure is it's repurposable. So even if you know that in 20 years' time a route is planned to be electrified, it still could make sense to operate hydrogen trains in the interim, because the infrastructure left behind when the trains move to other areas would be usable for other purposes. So you could power buses, cars, whatever. And I think one of the reasons we've seen that 5-year prospect on hydrogen cars for so many years is that unless or until you get to critical mass with the fueling stations, people are always nervous. And it's the same thing we see with electric cars. Although we're told that there's a huge take-up, it's still relatively low in the scheme of the market.
Frighteningly tiny, still talking about point percentages,
Yeah, exactly. And that's due to the recharging availability. So I think the more our deployment of fuel stations could offer alternatives for other modes as well, the better.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think that's the end of the question. I might have missed a few questions, and apologies for that. And I'll try and follow them up if I didn't, and chase me, everyone, if I've missed your questions. But that's been brilliant, Mike. Thanks so much for that. We're running horribly late, quarter of an hour late, but that's been worth it because it's just really interesting, and we've had a lot of questions. Lots of people just really interested in following that through. What I'm going to do is, I think, let's have a look. Oh yeah, there we are. The final there. Thanks to Alstom as well for letting you come and do this. Thanks to various people for prodding me and suggesting this was a very good idea. And no, it's a pleasure to have a chat with you again, Mike. It's been great. Very quickly, I'll go through and say thanks to Heel for putting this on, somehow managing by the force of tech to put this on iTunes. Rail Natter is now on iTunes, Spotify, and the other one as well, the Colourful Bands one that I've forgotten the name of. So go on, if you want to listen to it rather than watch it, which is daft if you've all been sat here watching it for an hour, then you can do that. Right now, in fact, 14 minutes ago, this video went up about maglev, so you can enjoy that. It's a beast. And also on Friday, there will be the next in the Permanent Way series, and you can find out more about that by going onto my YouTube channel as well. Next week, we've got Dr. David Turner joining to talk about beer, another fuel of the nation. So that should be good fun, and hopefully the tech will work. Actually, to be fair, I think it's been all right, Mike, hasn't it? The tech it's not collapsed around us.
I think so.
Yeah.
Looks like the worst tech seems to be the lighting in my room now.
Yeah, likewise. I need to sort lighting out because at the moment I've got this lampshade which is just horrible. Well, actually, it's a nice lampshade, but it's not very good for camera. But we'll get there. So that's also make your theme requests for Rail Natter more generally, everyone. And if you want to drop me a coffee on Ko-fi, great. It really helps. Thank you. And it only remains to say thanks. Thanks very much indeed, Mike. Absolute pleasure. Thanks for joining. Maybe sometime in the future, 2023, if Rail Natter is still going, we can do one of these in a train or something. I don't know, in a hydrogen train running around on the network. That'd be nice. Absolute pleasure. Cheerio, everyone, and thank you, Mike. Cheers now. Bye.